So for those of you who don't know me, I am Ivana Gazabara and I lead our prototyping work at Transcap. And I'm so delighted that so many of you here are here today. And I'm assuming that's because you all have an interest in regenerative agriculture, and some of you have an interest in the financing of regenerative agriculture, which is brilliant to see because that's what our work over the last year has focused on, the work that we're sharing today. And it's a topic that's really dear to my heart, and a really active area of work for Transcap. So great. And I'm going to say a little bit about Transcap itself, just on the assumption that some of you don't know very much or perhaps nothing at all about us. So in brief, we're an 8-person strong, 3-year young nonprofit. Our work is really focused on evolving the way that the finance system uses money in order to create more transformative change in the world. And we think that actually using the tools of systems thinking is a really good way to reframe finance because, and those of you who are in this field will know this, but systems thinking is all about trying to create those deep structural permanent changes in human systems and doing that in this kind of orchestrated, quite deliberate way. And at Transcap, we think you should be able to do the same thing with money. And in terms of kind of the day-to-day of what we actually do, we have 3 different programs of work. One is focused on research. So this is about taking some of the tools of systems thinking and complexity science, a lot of which is sometimes quite academic and esoteric, and trying to create things that investors and funders can use to operationalize what we call systemic investing. And actually, the Regen Ag mapping work I'll be talking about is a pretty good example of us trying to sort of create quite practical strategic tools and frameworks for the field at large. And the Regen Ag work is also a good example of something that we are hoping to translate into a prototype as a next step. And prototyping is where we're sort of doing the design and the building and helping with the capitalization of systemic finance vehicles and programs. And so this bit of the work is really about bridging that gap between theory and practice and answering some of the practical questions about how systemic investing actually works in the real world. Where does the money land? How are systemic finance vehicles governed? All that practical stuff that helps demonstrate how it works as an approach in practice. And finally, we do some field building, and this is really just in recognition of the fact that as a small nonprofit, our kind of impact pathway is not going to be about building a countless number of systemic finance vehicles. It's much more so about building the field. So the way that we do this is through convenings and curating a few kind of communities of practice around specific questions that we think are really important for the field. So that's Transcap in a nutshell. And the piece of work that we'll be sharing about today it started about a year ago, and I have to do a couple of shout outs around that, one of which is to the New Capitalism Project Lab, which is a funder collaborative that really believed in this in the early days and gave us a grant to get started with. And also the Meridian Institute, which is an organization that I suspect many of you know, and they have been an incredibly supportive partner throughout this process. They do quite a lot of work on agriculture in the US, particularly on the policy side. And they were kind of often our eyes and ears on the ground and have such a big body of work across the Midwest. So that was incredibly helpful. And so this work really started a year ago with this question around how can capital and also capital holders and allocators support the transition to regenerative agriculture in the Midwest? And it started as a phase of systems analysis, and I'll share some of those outputs in a minute. But our ultimate aim with this work is, as I was saying earlier, to build it up into a prototype. So to actually design and structure and implement a systemic capital platform for regenerative agriculture in the region. And in doing that, also create a blueprint for capital deployment, which is hopefully useful and interesting for agricultural transitions in other contexts as well, and potentially for sort of transitions writ large also. Um, and this is a very small snapshot of the transition map that we built in Kumu. Don't worry about trying to read the detail. It's just illustrative. We'll put a link to the Kumu map in the chat so that you can explore it properly. And then I'll also peel back some of the layers and give you a rundown of the key elements inside the map as well. But essentially, this map is almost a kind of, suppose you could call it an interactive report embedded in a Kumu. And Kumu, for those of you who don't know it, is a mapping platform. And within that platform, we built this kind of analysis, which hinged on pretty lengthy literature review and also a whole lot of stakeholder dialogues and consultations where we spoke to everyone from farmers to agronomists to NGOs to investors, really trying to get a pretty diverse picture of all the perspectives of actors from across the system. And we, in that transition map, essentially showcased the key blockers, the enablers for the transition, the systemic challenges, and the leverage points for transformation, and also the kind of specific capital intervention strategies that correspond to those leverage points. We also mapped the ecosystem of stakeholders and organizations that are already sort of acting within this space, engaging across those leverage points in support of the regenerative agriculture agenda in the region. And actually that's quite interactive. So you can go into Kumu, tell us who we've missed. There's a kind of submission form that will then enable us to add more in on the back end. So that's a kind of snapshot of the map. And then I just want to peel back some of the layers of the onion, as it were, and start at the beginning. So first of all, the first category of information that we looked at and put onto the map was these sort of push and pull factors that we saw through research and conversations were really driving the transition. So we were really asking the question here of what are the key variables that are either acting as blockers or enablers of the transition, and then how are they networked together through causal relationships? And those are the loops that you see there on that diagram. And again, this is really small, so don't worry about reading the information. Actually, my colleague Andre is going to give you a little whistle-stop tour through the map later, so you'll be able to see a bit more of the detail there. But it's the analysis of the patterns of across those barriers and enablers that then led us to the next layer of insight in the map, which was what we call the systemic challenges in regenerative agriculture in the Midwest. So these are the places where we were seeing the system is deeply stuck. They're deep-rooted, they're persistent, they're interconnected. But the other thing that emerged from this analysis is, of course, that flip side of the challenge coin, which is what we are calling the transition leverage points. And these are really the solution spaces that we think we need to crowd capital, but also other resources into in order to create those tipping points in the system and support this transition at the pace and scale that really matters. And I want to walk you through each one of those. And I suspect that since a lot of you are deep experts in this field, each one will be pretty familiar to you. And what I want to put forth is really this idea that what we need is orchestrated action across all of them simultaneously in order to support the transition. And so I will just start with something we called the farmer's trap for shorthand in our Kumu, but it's essentially this idea that farmers in the Midwest are trapped by this combination of rising land prices and the shrinking profitability of farming, right? So we need to be investing in solutions that are increasing access to land for regenerative farmers and making land more affordable, because this question of long-term land stewardship is so crucial to the transition. Landowners and also anybody who has a longer term lease arrangement is going to be much more inclined and incentivized to invest in sustainable practices because they can then fully realize the benefits of those investments. But even if you wanted to farm regeneratively and had access to land, you might struggle because you might not have the capabilities. So at the moment, regenerative agriculture is, it is not taught at scale in agricultural colleges and through technical assistance programs. So the mainstay of education in agriculture is still centered around intensive input heavy farming. And so what we need to be seeing is, the normalization of teaching practices that are about improving soil health, water quality, biodiversity, carbon sequestration through education, as well as kind of practical training programs. And then the other thing is that since everyone around you farms in a similar way, and you've perhaps been farming that way for a whole generation, there's also quite a lot of cultural inertia to change. And because mindsets and culture are, of course, at the foundation of our current system, then shifts in mindset are also obviously key to transforming that, whether that's through farmer-led learning networks or key stage education on soil health for kids, or any number of other interventions which are so needed in the system. And those cultural barriers actually also get reinforced by the fact that, objectively speaking, there's very little support out there financially to help farmers make the transition if they want to do so. So, it's not to say that those loan and crop warranty products are not out there at all, but they're just quite a small slice of the market. So by and large, underwriting policies for agricultural lending and insurance are currently not acknowledging or even incentivizing regenerative farming practices. And you've got the government basically reinforcing that to some extent by providing subsidies for the production of staple crops like corn and soy. And that just leads right back to that cycle of intensive monocropping. So we need to create financial products that can support farmers with both that initial dip in profitability and then also the initial investments that we need to see that are required essentially during the transition period. Um, and even if you were to go against the grain on all of that, guess what? There might not be much of a market for a regenerative product at the moment. So we need to find ways to actually guarantee that market demand, not just for farmers, but also processors and distributors of regenerative products, in order to send a signal to the industry that investing in regenerative agriculture is economically worthwhile, right? So, this is about public procurement programs, advanced market commitments, market making mechanisms at a big enough scale to actually make a dent in the system. But even if there is market demand, there's a good chance that you could struggle to get your product to market, of course, because the supply chain infrastructure for regenerative agriculture just isn't there at the scale that we need. So sometimes people refer to this as the missing middle of the supply chain, but essentially, as farmers transition to producing regeneratively, we need to finance the infrastructure that can bring these products to market. And then finally, as most of you know, of course, unlike organic, regeneratively grown food doesn't get a price premium at the market in the market at the moment. So consumers who are, of course, largely convenience price led at the moment are pretty much unsure about what regen ag even is, let alone convinced about its benefits. So we need to also be working on building that sustainable long-term demand. This is about advocacy, it's about key stage education, it's also about shelf space for regenerative products and a whole host of other interventions. So this is kind of the full set of leverage points. It's a quick snapshot. Of course, feel free to go into Kumu later and explore this in more depth. But the other thing to say at this point is that because those leverage points, they're quite high altitude, it is, of course, necessary to get a bit more granular in order to understand, well, what are the specific capital-led interventions that can activate those leverage points? So under each of the leverage points in the Kumu, you will see a number of sort of capital intervention strategies. There are just too many of these to talk through right now, obviously, but broadly speaking, they're the mechanisms and the strategies that can that are more specific and are kind of acting on the leverage points. And just one thing I want to draw your attention to is that around those gray circles where the intervention strategies are captured, you'll see sort of color coding. Those little different colored rings, they tell you which of the leverage points these strategies are connected to. And so what's interesting about that is that some of the strategies which have a number of different color-coded rings around them are potentially really, really powerful interventions because they are acting across multiple leverage points with knock-on effects across the system, therefore. And then the kind of last thing to say about the map is that happily we did not make it up. So there are pockets of this future all over the present. In order to reflect that, we did map the, over 120 organizations and initiatives that are already working across these leverage points. But those circles are so small on the Komoot that I found it really hard to represent in PowerPoint. So what I've done instead is just pulled out a few visual examples on this slide to give you a sense of that tapestry of activity. So yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot in there. And I think that's probably a good 101 on the map and what's in there and how we built it up. And I just want to sort of finish with a few minutes just talking about some of the meta learnings from doing this transition mapping process, because I think although we obviously learned so much about regenerative agriculture in the Midwest, and there's so much sort of content specific insight in there. I think there's some stuff coming out of this that is pointing us to a pathway for capital structuring and capital architecture that I think is interesting in support of transitions more broadly. And I think the first thing to say there is that we need capital orchestration, right? So there is capital already flowing into regenerative agriculture, whether that's federal funding or philanthropic grants, some private equity, bit of venture capital. But those different types of capital allocators are mostly not talking to each other, despite the fact that, at least notionally, they're kind of working towards the same implicit vision. So what we need to be thinking about is how do we develop and nurture groups of investors and funders that are committed to a shared mission of advancing regenerative agriculture and get them to start more strategically aligning on how capital flows into these spaces. And that orchestration, we would argue, needs to happen in the context of a strategic investment platform. So most of the interventions in regenerative agriculture, from what we're seeing so far, are still what you'd call kind of investments in single point solutions. So a loan product or an investment into a single piece of infrastructure or a single project. And often the default financing solution for a lot of this stuff is a new fund. And, there's so much interest in this agenda at the moment. Andrea and I feel like almost every week we're reading about another new regen ag fund that's being launched somewhere around the world. But I think very few organizations are performing the analytical work to understand where is the system today, where does it need to go, how could it get there, and then what does all this mean for capital deployment? And so we've done a bit of that work now with the transition map. And as you've seen, it suggests a number of specific leverage points. But to my earlier point, you can't think of these in isolation. They're so networked and they really impact on each other. So we need to activate them simultaneously and strategically. And this is where we think a kind of integrated systemic financing platform is a really important part of the solution. And that platform needs to be designed in a way to achieve combinatorial effects. Now, that's a bit of transfab jargon, but in simple terms, it's what I call the 1 + 1 = 3 approach to funding and investing, because the sum of the financing portfolio needs to be greater than its parts. So this means you're designing a portfolio where actually individual investments are amplified by being strategically aligned with each other so that they're mutually reinforcing. And to give you a kind of an example of that from within the ag system, we could think about creating, let's say, a market making mechanism like an offtake agreement or an advance market commitment, and that can help guarantee the market for regenerative commodities and provide growers with a better, more steady cash flow. But we might then also need to think about creating specialized loan and insurance products to support those growers with making that transition. And also potentially thinking about funding technical assistance programs, which can help with effective land management practices and so on. So that each of these investments actually has a strategic relationship with the other and is mutually reinforcing. And if you think about this in the context of how finance functions today, it's pretty radically different, right? Because all of a sudden, the key question for us as investors is about, say, a new potential investment is not whether it looks good on its own, but whether it adds value to the strategic portfolio overall. And then that moves you from basically looking for risk reduction through diversification to actually looking for value creation through strategic synergies. And then, this might be an obvious point to add, but we need to do all this with a polycapital architecture. So a single type of capital is just not sufficient to finance something as holistic as this. And we need to really be asking ourselves, how do we create an investment program for regenerative agriculture that contains multiple pots of money within it and deploys multiple different types of capital? And what is the most appropriate legal structure for that and governance structure? And how does that evolve over time? Because obviously, this is not a static construct, because as the system evolves, so do its funding needs. And then so funding architecture also should evolve alongside that. And then finally, we need to sort of nest all of this within what all the other stuff that's sort of happening across the system. So because scaling up regenerative agriculture is only going to be possible if a lot of different kinds of changes are happening concurrently and with a degree of shared directionality, whatever is happening within the context of an investment platform, some of that can be triggered or amplified through commercial capital. Some might not be commercially investable, but it can be funded through philanthropic or public capital, maybe. And then there's stuff beyond the portfolio, changes that are happening and necessarily will happen independently of capital flows, like changes in consumer behavior or policy shifts, but actually an investment platform's impact potential will increase if it's synergistically aligned with these actions that are happening elsewhere in the system. And I think in practice, what this probably means is being much more aware of others working in the same system and also proactively engaging with them and perhaps collaborating with them in a way that I think is probably not commonly not a common way of operating in finance and many other fields at the moment. Um, Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because that is quite a lot. And I don't know how we're doing on the chat and whether this is a good moment to hand over to Andre for a little map demo, or do we want to sort of answer a few questions?
No, Andre's already registered, answered one in the Q&A, but there is one very pertinent to your the latter part of your presentation, which is, I can't say who it's from because it's asked anonymously, but the question is, you said that we need orchestrated action to move regen forward. And there are two questions. Which actors do you envision orchestrating? And how do you reconcile that with market-based incentives, which are atomic versus explicitly also?
So I think to start with the first question, which is around which actors, I think what feels particularly live for us at the moment, and by the way, our next step at Transcap will be to actually do some design work around what a financing platform for this could look like in the region. Um, we are doing this work in partnership with the Walton Family Foundation, and we've already started reaching out potentially to some of you to sort of kick off dialogues around this. It feels really important to make sure that those groups that historically haven't been at the decision-making table around how capital flows. So I'm not talking about consultation, I'm talking about financial decision-making power here. That this sort of strategic capital facilitator or orchestrator explicitly tries to change this through governance. And, I don't have an answer at this moment about the details of what those governance structures and bodies should look like, but that is something that will be a really important part of that design work for us. And then in terms of, and because I'm conscious that the question might have also just been about where might the money flow and who are the actors that are going to be involved on that side of things. I think the thing to say there is that there are already so many instruments and vehicles doing this work in the field. And, I flashed up logos of some of those on one of the slides earlier, but we are talking here about the Mad Ags, the stewards, the pot liquors of this world. And I think one of the questions that we're asking ourselves right now also, and when we'll want to unpick in the design is this capital facilitation simply about being able to find ways to channel more capital to some of those existing players in the market? Um, or do we need to build more similar models? So that also feels really live, and we don't have an answer to that question yet, but it's obvious enough that there's enough already happening right now that it feels hugely important to work with the stuff that already works, if that makes sense. And I fear I've in the process of answering the first question, I've forgotten the second one.
It was just how do you reconcile that orchestrated action with market-based incentives, which are atomic
Atomic.
versus
Uh,
orchestrated, yes, and are the fundamental missing piece to move the market at scale.
yeah. That's a really great question, and I have to confess, I don't have a ready answer to that. I think, and by the way, Andre, feel free to jump in at any point, but I think what feels relevant here is that this is not necessarily about reinventing the wheel, but much more about better strategic orchestration of some of the stuff that might already be happening in the market. So it's not really going counter to market incentives. It's more about trying to convene some of the players that are already working in this space, and trying to achieve better strategic alignment, really. But Andre, I don't know whether you have anything to add on this.
Yeah, just to add that um, this is a nascent field, yes, but there we have had a couple of examples of successful capital deployment, of successful funds going to their second or third raise, which is providing proof points that investing for regenerative agriculture is is a successful hypothesis because these businesses tend to be more resilient. Farms are diversified and are not only dependent on one crop, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're starting to see this data trickle in. And our hope is that the more data we can gather and show the we essentially decrease the entrance barrier for more market-based investors to crowd into the space. That is one way to see it. The other way to see it is that within these polycapital structures, we can design for some kind of a blended finance vehicle where we're using catalytical capital, patient capital, grant money perhaps to de-risk some of these investments, and then hopefully also crowd in more market-based investors. But it is a journey, and we're only at the start of it.
One additional question here from Frederick. An interesting question, both of you, about system boundaries. How did you deal with designing the boundaries of your inquiry? What happens to information that's out of scope, and who decides what that is?
Yes, that's such a great question. So we candidly, the boundary definition in the first instance was a mix of strategic and opportunistic. So strategically, obviously, the Midwest is one of the world's most important agricultural regions, and is also really steeped in intensive monoculture. So the potential for impact is massive. We also knew that in at least in some parts of the Midwest, certain regenerative practices had already kind of taken hold to an extent. So we also knew that there was a kind of starting point for doing this thinking, talking to people within the region about it, and building up the system analysis. I definitely think that for so that has felt very useful, that broad boundary for the analysis part, because what we discovered in the process of doing this work and having conversations with other networks in other places is that actually a lot of this is translatable into other contexts. Perhaps not everything, but at the altitude level of the leverage points, actually, a lot of this stuff is not unique to the Midwest. Other regions and other agricultural systems face the same challenges and have the same sort of interesting pressure points where we might need to act more deliberately. For the design of the capital platform, we will definitely be zooming in, because I think that when you start to think about the specifics of what a capital orchestrator needs to do, I think it needs to be much more place-based. And so we are really looking at, state level, if not kind of county level, or even bioregional contexts for doing the next phase of this work, and creating a kind of pilot facility.
I think another boundary that's worthwhile mentioning, Ivana, is the boundary of our intervention hypothesis. So we very much focused on interventions that are based on capital deployment strategies.
Sure.
We did that because we think we are well positioned to bring about and to propose these hypotheses based on the transition pathways and theories of change that we've identified. We're less perhaps prepared to propose interventions that are perhaps on the policy side, on the political systems. And so even though we have identified a couple of enablers or blockers, such as pricing and scope 3 emissions, and that can come through a change in regulations, we haven't really proposed an intervention that would go about enacting that in the system. We believe that and we know there are think tanks and other organizations out there that are doing amazing work in this sphere. And so we leave that work to others, and we focus on what we have particular know-how and skill sets to propose. And with that, I think I'm going to go into the map here, Ivana. And please feel free to keep asking questions in the Q&A. We would love to get to those later. I think the idea here I won't provide an in-depth view of the map, but rather just show a couple of nodes and provide a perspective of how one can be reading this map. And just gonna give a couple of quick tips of how to best use the map, really. So first things first, if you're new to Kumu, there's these three little dots here at the left-hand side, which opens up our navigation menu with a couple of instructions, how to use map tutorials, different background purposes and purpose of the map, and different links to all the systemic challenges and leverage points. Now, going into the map, we call these nodes that compose a systemic challenge transition factors. Now, these transition factors, they are both enablers and blockers. We try to name them as neutral as possible and showcase the interaction of different nodes through the connectors. So an example is short-term tenancy contracts. In the Midwest, approximately 50% of the land is rented out for growers. So the growers don't actually own the land. And most of that tenancy contract, they tend to be between 1 to 3 years, with most of them being yearly contracts. That has a direct relationship with the propensity of land that is farmed using conventional practices. The reason for that is if you are a tenant in a land and you only have a 1-year contract, you're less likely to invest for regenerating the land, because that's a process that takes 4 to 5 years. And a way to read this map is to continue following on the connectors. So land being farmed conventionally, that is directly linked to soil health. So then there's a decrease in soil health. The decrease in soil health leads to a decrease in agriculture productivity. Decreasing agriculture productivity forces farmers to use even more agrochemicals to keep pushing for higher yields. This generates increased demand, which increases the cost of the leading into a situation that you have decreasing desirability of farming combined with higher economic opportunities in cities. You have rural to urban exodus, and you have a decreasing next generation of farmers. So that's an example of how you can follow through the transition map and see how one node is actually connected to the other. Now, all of this example, they pertains to what we're calling the farmer's trap. But here in the next generation farmer, you'll see that this node has actually 2 colors. The inner color represents the systemic challenge that node is most prominently connected to, and the outer color demonstrates a systemic challenge that node is also connected to, but perhaps less prominently. In this example, a decrease of next generation farmers actually is connected to cultural barriers and to the transition. What we've been noticing in this example is that younger populations are more prone to have a higher buy-in for region ag land management practices. So if we're not having a lot of young generations coming into farming practices, then there's a higher tendency of the system getting stuck in conventional land management practices. And this is obviously connected to the dominance of conventional agriculture in education and training, which I'm not going to go in so much detail now. Now, going back to the starting point, short-term tenancy contract, you can see the outer layer is connected to the risky transition. And the reason behind that is that because you have a short-term tenancy contract, the banks are usually going to give you short-term financing. The insurance are going to usually give you short-term insurance, which then leads growers and farmers to deploy short-term land management practices, which eventually leads them to conventional land management practices and monocultures. So this is all on the problem space, on the challenge space. So these are all of our 7 systemic challenges. Now, one of the key innovation pieces of this transition map is, after reading many reports and many interviews, we've noticed that there was a lack of actionability in most of the reports we read. And with that, we mean the reports were great information, but for a systemic investor coming into the system, it didn't provide a lot of guidance into how to go about deploying capital in a systemic way. And so we tried to design the map to produce this visual representation of different intervention strategies and how these intervention strategies are connected to different transition factors, and thereby either catalyzing or mitigating a blocker or enabler, and therefore acting on specific leverage points. Now, if I turn on all the solutions space, the map gets quite crowded and overwhelming. And so we created these buttons here for you to filter through specific leverage points that one would like to focus. That's one way to reduce the complexity of the map. I'm going to focus on one intervention strategy just to bring up about a point that Ivana made earlier today about these different flag colors. If I highlight this intervention, which is an offtake agreement, you'll see that it has 4 different colors connected to it. That is because this intervention strategy hypothetically can catalyze 4 different leverage points. An offtake agreement is a future agreement where an offtaker will basically guarantee demand at a stable price to farmers. That is creating a market because there's that future guarantee of demand. That future guarantee and product throughput through the supply chain guarantees also that there is enough volume for processing and distribution facilities to be set up to process that specific crop. That future contract can also help with the risky transition because farmers now have guaranteed demand. And because of that guaranteed demand, farmers can also get financing from banks, leveraging that as collateral. And also because there's this future demand guarantee, it also helps with mental barriers and cultural perceptions to regen ag being too risky, because now you have future demand and you have a buyer for your products. And so it reduces both the mental perception of risk, but also the actual risk of the transition by being able to finance those new commodities. So I'll leave it at that at this point, and I think we can turn on to questions and hopefully make this as useful as possible for our participants.
Andre, I can see Ivana is busy at work there answering as many questions as she can in the Q&A. Brilliant.
Yes.
Perhaps we could.
I've taken a crack at a few of the ones that I thought would be kind of simpler to answer just by typing, but that has still left many big questions in there. So thank you for such considered questions, first of all. And apologies in advance if we're not answering them fully in this context of the hour-long webinar. I'll leave it, Madeline, I'll hand it over to you to sort of moderate us through that in the time that we have left, which might not be time to answer everything. So
yes, we don't have
perhaps we pick and choose.
time. So let's pick a few here. So Catherine's asking, do you have an overarching mission or outcomes you are working towards? You mentioned more deliberate inclusion of historically marginalized people from capital allocation. How have you thought about community wealth building or reducing wealth inequality in this work?
Okay, so, and this will just be like a small slice of the answer that you want, I'm sure, Catherine, but I think the context of place is what's really critical there. So I think in some ways that focus on place and starting small, so starting within the context of a particular farming community, and in the context of a kind of specific supply chain, and then building out from there, which I think might at least hopefully partially answer Anthony's question, which was about like, is this about an additional 2% of acres, 20% of acres, or just conceptualization versus implementation? And I think probably our thinking right now is demonstrate in a microcosm. So maybe it's the 2% of acres, which I think also then links back to a strategy which it will be more adept as kind of at local sort of economic and social value building for communities, because then you start thinking about, you know, an example of, I don't know, oat or soy farmers in a particular county, and supporting both the infrastructure and the capacity building, and the kind of financial resilience of that community, and trying to build the blueprint of a financing platform around that. And I think in some ways that is better for local communities than taking a more bird's eye approach of building this at a higher level even though I'm conscious that as I say that, we also need to be thinking about scale and replication of this work.
So IS, apologies if I'm mispronouncing any names here. IS is asking, have you confirmed the leverage points with, oh, I've just lost the, it's moving as it happens. Have you confirmed the leverage points with the stakeholders, and have you thought about the next steps after the mapping is complete? How are you planning to deal with it getting into motion? And in fact, a couple of others have asked that same kind of question.
Yeah.
Jean-Louise, who's asked, have you identified or engaged potential anchor funders or grant makers in the Midwest who could help hold this collaboration, e.g. McKnight Foundation?
Yes. So we have tested this with stakeholders to answer the first question. So we built this with stakeholders, and then we sort of took it back to a number of people in a variety of different contexts, both one-to-one and workshop, to go, hey, does this resonate? What are we missing? And so on. By and large, I think people are saying, yes, leverage points, that feels right. We haven't yet been told something really gargantuan or obvious has been missed, but obviously, do tell us your feedback in comments and afterwards. Um, we have thought about what we want to do next. So the next phase will be a detailed design work on a financing platform in the context of a specific pilot location. So we're currently looking for that context and having conversations with our networks in the Midwest to understand what might make sense as a kind of starting point for a work like this. We are also talking about potential funders and grant makers, including the McKnight Foundation and the likes of Builders Vision and obviously Walton Family Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation. Um, Walton has obviously sort of provided the design grant uh, for us to be able to do this work. And so I think we are really aware, and some of this is from our previous lives, not necessarily always from Transcap experience, but these sorts of initiatives often fall down when it comes to the question, or they hit a wall when it comes to the question of really hard on tough now, and already in the past. So yes, and obviously, again, suggestions and feedback are always welcome.
Probably got time for one or two more questions. Ami's asking, she's curious, did you also create, because this is an excellent map of the current situation, did you also create a future system map to outline the preferred direction?
So this is in fact less so a map of the current situation. I mean, I think it was our stab at sort of actually capturing the transition needs rather than depicting the status quo necessarily. We have sort of embedded the changes that we think need to happen to get us to a preferred future state, which I think is probably something other than a system map. It's more like a kind of a visioning exercise, I suppose. But we've not done that, and that is probably something that we would need to do. Although again, in on quite a granular level, I think, as part of the next phase of the work. So zooming in much more rather than staying at the Midwestern level, because the Midwest, as many of you know, is both vast and also diverse as a region. So yeah.
One last question, I think. Someone said that agribusiness spent 500 million US dollars. Oh, it keeps moving the screen to lobbying to influence the next farm bill over the next 4 years, so that public funds are used to ensure agribusiness profits. How do you see this work influencing policy to counter this industry influence?
Yes, a great question. And obviously, post-election, the future of this work is kind of, evolving, and the agricultural system in the US. I mean, let's see how that will all shape up. Um, I think for us, although we were conscious doing this work, that for us the boundaries were, how do you pinpoint the strategies that capital allocators can directly engage on? Um, that we are coordinating very actively with groups in the US that are much more policy led and orientated towards influencing policy. So we partnered on doing this work with the Meridian Institute, who runs something called the 𝐦𝐮𝐻𝐡 Coalition, which is very focused on sort of addressing policy barriers to regenerative agriculture. And we continue to work with them, but also a group called FORA, Funders for Regenerative Agriculture, where philanthropic funders, that's not but the only thing that they do, but they are pretty focused on understanding like what are the ways that philanthropic funders can actually influence the policy landscape in a way that channels more support for regenerative agriculture and to some extent counters some of that lobbying influence, which is enormous, and not just in the US. Agribusiness lobbies more actively and generously than even oil and gas on a global level, I think.
Great. Well, there's 2 minutes left, so we better let you all go. Just a huge thank you from us for again sharing your time with us.
Yes.
We appreciate it. I've put a few links in the chat. Many of you already well in touch with us, but if you're not, please follow us on LinkedIn, sign up to our newsletter, and we can keep you up to date. There's loads going on. If you're interested in other parts of our work, we have 2 webinars coming up where we do a deep dive into builders' vision and their ocean strategy, which is the first in a series of new case studies we're doing. So keep an eye out on our LinkedIn for how you can sign up to those. And just a huge thanks to you all. We will feel free to always get in touch if you've got some additional questions or you want to talk to us about this in more depth. If we have sufficient interest, we're more than happy to run another one of these webinars and take some more questions. So thank you so much. Any last words from you, Andre and Ivana, before we let them go?
I mean, for me, just to echo the thank yous and to say we are here post-webinar, so please do get in touch with us. We'll share this. We've been kind of learning out loud through this work anyway, through just informal blog posts, LinkedIn posts, and so on. Yeah, just please do share feedback and questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and just to echo that also, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you everyone who accepted our interview requests. I know many of you were in this call today, so special thank yous to all of you. And also to echo that we do have a feedback form on that left-hand side of the map. And so feel free to take a stab at it and yeah, give us some feedback. One of the design principles was that this document, this report is a live report, which is one of the reasons why we've published it on Kumu. And so this is a work in progress. The system is they're always in movement, and we hope to keep this updated if it's useful for the ecosystem.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening, your day, wherever you are, and hopefully the weather improves for everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.